Rafferty made the right choice. That was what Aurelia Bright announced to the room. Not whispered, not implied, not left to interpretation. Announced. Her champagne flute raised above the heads of 400 of Toronto's most hopeful people. Her voice carrying across the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York with the confidence of someone who has been rehearsing this moment in her bathroom mirror for months. She was smiling. She was glowing. She believed she had won. She had no idea that the service doors at the far end of the ballroom were about to open. She had no idea who was standing on the other side of them. And she had absolutely no idea that the woman she had just publicly humiliated, the woman sitting 20 feet away, in a deep teal gown, holding a glass of water with both hands, saying nothing, had been waiting for exactly this moment for 4 months. If you're new to Ivory Secrets, welcome. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this one, and drop a comment below. Tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Now let's get into it. Evangeline Ashworth had found the hotel receipt on a Tuesday morning in late October. She had not been looking for it. That was the part she kept returning to in the weeks that followed. The sheer ordinariness of the moment in which everything changed. She had been sorting through Rafferty's dry cleaning because their housekeeper, a quiet Newfoundlander named Doris, who had worked for them for 6 years, had called in with a chest cold. And Evangeline, despite being married to a man whose net worth was somewhere north of $200 million, was not the kind of woman who let small domestic tasks pile up while she waited for someone else to handle them. She had always been like that. Her parents had raised her to be like that. Capable, self-sufficient, present in her own life in a way that didn't require an audience. The receipt was from Auberge du Pommier, a French restaurant in North York that Evangeline knew well. She had suggested it to Rafferty herself 3 years earlier. After attending a friend nearby, he had said it was too fussy, too precious, not his kind of place. He was a steak and bourbon man, he said. He didn't need a 12-course tasting menu to have a good evening. The receipt told her he had been there 4 times in the past 2 months, table for 2, late sittings, always a Friday. Evangeline stood in their walk-in closet on the 3rd floor of their Rosedale home and held that small piece of paper, and felt something she would later struggle to name accurately. Not shock. Shock implies you hadn't. Somewhere very deep and very quiet, already suspected. Not rage. Rage was too hot, too fast, too likely to make a person do something irreversible before they were ready. It was more like the sensation of pressing your hand against a wall. You believed was solid and feeling it give, just slightly. Just enough. She put the receipt back in the jacket pocket. She hung the jacket. She went downstairs and made tea. She sat at the kitchen table for 8 minutes. Then she made an appointment with an attorney. That was Evangeline Ashworth. That had always been Evangeline Ashworth. This was something Rafferty Cole had, over the course of 11 years of marriage, made the catastrophic mistake of forgetting. He had met her at a board dinner in Toronto when she was 29 and he was 34, and his development company, Cole and Associates, was still small enough that people were being generous when they called it mid-sized. She had been standing near the window, not at the bar, not working, the room, listening to a conversation on zoning legislation in the Greater Toronto Area with the focused, quietly intelligent attention of someone who already understood the subject and was interested in whether anyone else in the room did. Her name, he found out, was Evangeline Ashworth. He did not at the time fully understand what that name meant in this city. The Ashworth family was not the kind of old Toronto money that put its name on hospital wings or showed up in the society pages of Toronto life. They were the kind of family whose influence moved through Bay Street the way cold air moves through a building. You couldn't see it, but you felt it, and it got into everything. Cornelius Ashworth, Evangeline's father, had spent 40 years in private finance. He had sat on the boards of 3 of the country's largest pension funds. He had restructured companies that federal regulators had given up on. He had done it all with the methodical, undemonstrative patience of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be taken seriously. His phone calls were returned within the hour. His opinions on risk and capital were sought by people who ran institutions that employed thousands of Canadians who would never know his name. Cecily Ashworth, Evangeline's mother, was a woman of such complete and unperformed authority that younger women in philanthropic circles sometimes described her as intimidating, and then felt guilty about it because she was also extraordinarily warm. She had spent 30 years building what was now one of the most respected charitable foundations in the country, not as a social hobby, but as the work she had chosen with the same seriousness other people chose surgery. And then there was Prentice Ashworth, Evangeline's older brother, 46 years old, called to the bar in Ontario at 26, now a senior partner at one of the most formidable litigation firms on Bay Street. He did not lose. Not because he was lucky, not because he was charming, because he was relentless and precise and capable of holding a position under pressure for longer than most people in a courtroom had ever experienced from opposing counsel. Judges described his arguments as surgical. His opponents described them with less printable words. Rafferty Cole had married into this family. And then, gradually, the way a man does when success starts to feel like something he generated entirely on his own, he had forgotten that he had done so. Cole & Associates had grown significantly in its first 3 years, in part because 2 critical financing arrangements had been facilitated through Cornelius Ashworth's network. Not gifts, not informal favors. Properly structured, arm's-length introductions to capital partners who happened to take Rafferty's calls because a man they respected had told them the call was worth taking. At the time, Rafferty had been grateful, genuinely, visibly grateful. Over the years, that gratitude had faded into the background of the story he told about himself. The story of a self-made man who had built something extraordinary through vision and discipline, and the particular drive of someone who had grown up without money and decided that was a condition, not a destiny. He had revised himself out of the parts that didn't fit that narrative. The Ashworth connections had become, in his telling, a fortunate coincidence of timing. Good luck. He had been in the right place with the right pitch. He had stopped thinking about what and who had ensured he was even in that room. He had also, somewhere in the same period, stopped thinking about Evangeline. Aurelia Bright had joined Cole & Associates 18 months ago as Director of Acquisitions, a role Rafferty had personally approved. She was 32, sharp, strategic, possessed of the particular kind of confidence that comes from understanding your effect on people and deploying it deliberately. She had looked at Rafferty Cole and seen a man who was wealthy and successful, and visibly dissatisfied in ways he hadn't consciously identified yet, and she had made a calculated decision. She had pursued him with patience. And Rafferty, who had grown accustomed to being the most purposeful person in almost every room he entered, had been entirely unprepared for someone who out-pursued him. He told himself it was just dinner, then just one more dinner. Then he stopped telling himself anything. Evangeline had known about Aurelia before Rafferty had any idea she knew. She knew because she was Evangeline Ashworth, and she had spent her entire adult life watching her father navigate situations in which the most dangerous thing a person could do was react before they had all the information. She had hired a private investigator, not in anger, in precision. Within 3 weeks, she had photographs, records of hotel bookings made through a Cole & Associates corporate account, and documentation that her attorney, Beatrix Lowe, had helped her compile with the thoroughness of someone who understood exactly what kind of case they were building. Beatrix was 43, a family law specialist with 20 years of experience handling complex asset dissolutions in Ontario. When Evangeline had walked into her office and laid out the situation without crying, without raising her voice, and with a set of very specific questions about valuations and timelines, Beatrix had looked at her client and felt something she didn't often feel: uncomplicated respect. "You're not going to confront him," Beatrix had said. It wasn't a question. "Not yet," Evangeline said. "What are you waiting for?" Evangeline had looked out the window at the gray November sky above Queen Street West before she answered. "The right moment," she said. "There's always a right moment. You just have to be willing to wait for it." That had been 3 months ago. In those 3 months, Evangeline had done 3 things simultaneously. She had worked with Beatrix to build a settlement case that documented, with complete, meticulous accuracy, the actual history of Cole and Associates' growth, including the financing arrangements of the early years and the precise role that Ashworth family connections had played in making them possible. She had quietly begun the process of establishing a new charitable initiative focused on women entering skilled trades and technical professions across Ontario, and she had said nothing to Rafferty, nothing that mattered. She had gone to dinners with him. She had attended the functions they were scheduled to attend. She had behaved in every observable way like a woman who suspected nothing. If Aurelia and Rafferty were watching her for signs of awareness, they saw none. They mistook her composure for obliviousness. They had no idea they were watching a woman who had already finished the most important work she needed to do. The Ontario Commercial Real Estate Excellence Awards gala had been on the calendar since the previous spring. It was exactly the kind of event the Coles attended every year, expected, photographed, professionally significant. Evangeline had RSVP'd for both of them in April, before the autumn, before the receipt. In January, 2 weeks before the event, she had called her father. Cornelius Ashworth had listened to his daughter for 50 minutes without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. "You've handled this with complete integrity," he said. "I haven't done anything yet," Evangeline said. "That's what I mean," he said. She told him what she was thinking, the timing, the sequence, the specific moment she had identified as the pivot point. Cornelius listened, asked 2 questions, said he would speak with Cecily and Prentice. He called her back within the hour. "We'll be there," he said, "all 3 of us." "Dad, you don't have to." Evangeline, his voice had the quality it always had when there was nothing left to discuss. Not commanding, not loud, more like absolute. When has this family ever not showed up for one of its own? She didn't have an answer for that because he was right. The Ashworths showed up. That was simply what they did. The night of the gala, she dressed carefully. She chose a gown in deep teal, the color of Georgian Bay in September, understated, precise, the kind of dress that doesn't ask for attention because the woman wearing it generates it without trying. She wore only her grandmother's pearl earrings. Her hair was pulled back. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had made a decision and was ready to see it through. In the car on the way downtown, Rafferty sat beside her for 20 minutes looking at his phone. At one point he glanced over and said, "You look good." "Thank you," she said. She looked out at the January city, the snow on the Rosedale rooftops, the yellow windows of houses, where other lives were being lived, and thought about all the things she was not going to say tonight. All the hurt she was not going to perform in a ballroom full of people who would turn it into tomorrow's conversation. She was saving everything for the one moment that mattered. The car pulled up to the Fairmont Royal York on Front Street. Evangeline stepped out into the cold Toronto night, breathed slowly once and thought, "This is the last time I will walk into a room as Rafferty Cole's wife." Then she squared her shoulders and walked in. The ballroom was everything a room like this always is, a carefully managed performance of status, where conversations about deal flow were disguised as conversations about golf, and compliments on gowns were really assessments of whose fortunes had shifted since the last quarter. Evangeline moved through it with the ease of someone who had understood this particular social language since childhood. She found their table. She greeted the people nearby. She accepted a glass of water from a server and settled into a conversation with a woman named Donna Fairchild, whose family trust had recently donated to a literacy program Evangeline had been involved with for 4 years. She was aware, with the quiet total attention she gave to everything that mattered, of exactly where Rafferty was in the room and of who was standing beside him. Aurelia had made a choice tonight. She had arrived with Rafferty, not behind him, not at the professional distance that could be explained away later, but on his arm, openly, in a gown the color of burnt copper, with the specific body language of a woman who has decided that the private phase of her plan is officially over. Evangeline watched from across the room and felt something that surprised her slightly in its steadiness. Not rage, not the burning, sharp kind of hurt she might have expected. More like the cold, clean confirmation of something she had already understood in full, now simply made visible. Rafferty had made his choice. He had chosen to make it public. Very well. 20 minutes into the cocktail reception, Aurelia approached Evangeline's table. She moved with the deliberate ease of someone who has been preparing this walk across a room. She was watching Evangeline's face as she came, looking. Evangeline understood, for the flinch, the crack, the flash of tears or anger or desperate dignity that would confirm everything Aurelia had chosen to believe about her. She got none of it. "Evangeline," Aurelia said, arriving at the table with a dazzling, entirely manufactured smile. "It's lovely to finally meet you properly." Evangeline looked at her with an expression of complete, pleasant neutrality. "Rafferty's never mentioned you," she said, calmly, conversationally, without particular emphasis. It was simply a statement of fact, and the fact that this woman clearly believed she occupied a central and significant place in Rafferty Cole's life, while his wife had never once heard her name, was a gap so vast that the entire table could feel the air moving through it. Aurelia's smile held, something behind her eyes didn't. "Well," she said, "we're acquainted now." Evangeline looked at her for exactly 1 beat longer than was comfortable. Then she turned back to Donna and continued their conversation about the literacy program. Aurelia walked away. 3 tables over, Rafferty had watched the whole exchange. He had watched it with a complicated, unhappy mixture of things he did not have clean words for. Something like pride in Aurelia, something like guilt he had been suppressing for months, and something new that sat lower and colder and felt uncomfortably like the beginning of fear. He told himself the evening was going to be fine. He told himself this until the moment he stood at the microphone. The speech that he and Aurelia had scripted together over the past 3 weeks was not a speech at all. It was an announcement dressed in the language of gratitude and new beginnings. He talked about growth, about the courage to pursue what you actually wanted from your life, about leaving behind old arrangements that no longer served either party. He spoke in the careful, layered language of a man who wants an audience to understand something without being able to quote him on it directly. When he finished, there was the specific, uncertain applause of a room that suspects it has just witnessed something, but hasn't yet determined what. Then Aurelia stood. She raised her glass. "Tonight," she said, her voice carrying easily across the room, "I want to celebrate people who are brave enough to stop pretending." She paused. Some people spend years inside arrangements that were never right for them. They stay because it's familiar, because starting again feels frightening, but real happiness, real joy, belongs to those willing to reach for something true. She let her gaze move slowly, deliberately across the room. It landed on Evangeline. "To Rafferty," she said, "and to what comes next." The silence that followed was unlike any silence Evangeline had been in before. It was the silence of 400 people, holding their breath simultaneously. Not one person raised a glass in response, because every eye in that ballroom had moved to Evangeline. And Evangeline rose from her chair. Not dramatically, not quickly. She rose the way she did everything, with intention and complete composure, and for one suspended moment, she turned. She turned away from Aurelia. She turned away from She turned toward the service doors at the far end of the ballroom, because those doors were opening, and the people walking through them were about to change everything in this room. The doors opened the way power moves when it has nothing to prove, without announcement, without theater, and all at once. And the room felt it before it fully saw it. There is a particular stillness that falls over a crowd when something genuinely significant enters a space. Not the manufactured quiet of a ceremony. Something older, something instinctive, the recognition, at a level below conscious thought, that the balance of something has just shifted, that whatever was happening before is no longer the most important thing happening now. That stillness fell over the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York at 9:05 on a Tuesday night in January. Aurelia's champagne glass was still in the air. Cornelius Ashworth walked in first. He was 73 years old and looked like a man who had spent every one of those years making consequential decisions. Tall, silver-haired, with the particular physical stillness of someone whose internal confidence has never required performance to sustain itself. He wore a dark evening suit with the ease of a man for whom formal occasions are simply the backdrop of ordinary life. He did not scan the room when he entered. He did not assess the crowd. He walked in as though he had been expected, because in every room in this city that had ever mattered, Cornelius Ashworth had been. Beside him, Cecily Ashworth moved, with the grace of a woman who had spent 30 years, understanding that how you carry yourself in a room is itself a form of communication. She was 69, with dark observant eyes, and the quiet authority of someone who has never once needed to announce herself. And then came Prentice Ashworth. Prentice was 46 and built, physically, professionally, like a man who understood that presence is its own argument. He was a litigator the way that certain people are surgeons, not as a career, but as a fundamental identity. He had spent 2 decades on Bay Street dismantling cases that opposing counsel had believed were unlosable. And the thing about Prentice that made him genuinely frightening to anyone who understood what they were looking at was not his intelligence, not his record. It was his patience. He could wait longer than anyone in the room. He could hold a position longer. He looked exactly like that now. Composed, alert, watching. The whispers started within seconds. The discreet, rapid kind that move through a crowd of well-connected people who have spent their lives learning to communicate. Without being visibly observed doing so, Evangeline could feel them moving through the room like current through still water. She knew what they were saying because she had heard versions of these whispers her entire life. That's Cornelius Ashworth. Is that the whole family? Rafferty Cole is married to an Ashworth? I didn't know. She's an Ashworth? She watched the comprehension move through the room, watched people recalibrate in real time, watched expressions shift as the social mathematics of the evening rearranged itself around a fact that the Ashworth family's presence had made impossible to ignore. Donna Fairchild, still sitting beside her, turned very slowly. "Evangeline," she said in barely a breath, "is that your family?" "Yes," Evangeline said. "Your maiden name is Ashworth." "It is." Donna looked at her for a long moment. "How long have you been planning tonight?" Evangeline picked up her water glass. "Long enough," she said. Across the room, Rafferty Cole had gone completely still. This meant something, for a man like Rafferty. He was kinetic by nature, forward energy, momentum, the particular drive of someone who had built something real and had spent his adult professional life being the most purposeful person in almost every room he entered. Stillness was not in his vocabulary. Uncertainty was not a condition he had much experience managing. But he was very still right now, staring at the entrance with an expression that Evangeline, from across the ballroom, recognized without satisfaction, but with the clear-eyed recognition of a woman who had predicted exactly this. It was the expression of a man who has just understood, in one cascading moment, the calculation he staked everything on was built on a premise that was simply wrong. He had thought the Ashworths were background. He had told himself that story so many times it had become the only story he knew. He was starting to understand, watching Cornelius cross the ballroom with that unhurried, absolute authority, that he had been catastrophically wrong. Prentice had moved to speak quietly with 2 men near the north wall, both members of Cole and Associates' board of directors. Evangeline watched the exchange, watched both men's expressions shift, that particular professional gravity that descends on people when they are receiving information they know will require action. There it is, she thought, the first piece moving. Cecily crossed directly to Evangeline's table. She did not rush. She sat down beside her daughter and placed one hand briefly on Evangeline's arm, and the gesture was small and complete and said everything without a word. My daughter is not alone here. Whatever you thought you were watching tonight, look again. Aurelia was watching all of this. And for the first time since she had walked into this ballroom on Rafferty's arm, with the absolute certainty of someone who has already won, Aurelia felt something cold move through her. Something she didn't yet have a name for. It sat in her chest like a weight. She looked at Rafferty. Rafferty was not looking at her. He was looking at Cornelius. "Rafferty," she said quietly. He didn't respond. "Rafferty." Sharper. He turned. The expression he was failing to fully control was one she had never seen there before. The expression of a man recalibrating urgently, the way a navigator recalibrates when they realize the map they have been using is wrong. "Who are they?" she asked. "The Ashworths," he said. His voice had gone flat. She waited for more. He didn't offer more. "Rafferty, I don't understand why everyone is." "Because," he said, and something in his voice had shifted entirely. The financing arrangements that kept this company alive in its first 3 years were facilitated through Cornelius Ashworth's network, not directly, properly structured, arm's length. But the introductions came from him, and I have spent the last decade telling people I built this company from scratch. He paused. "And Prentice Ashworth is talking to my board members right now." Aurelia looked across the room, looked at Prentice's face, then at the board members' faces. "What does that mean?" she asked. Rafferty finally looked at her directly. "It means," he said quietly, "that I made a very serious mistake." She assumed he meant a business mistake. She would not understand until much later that the mistake he was describing was the larger one, made 11 years into a marriage to a woman he had stopped truly seeing, he read as passivity, and whose silence he had mistaken for defeat. Rafferty walked toward his father-in-law. He did it because standing on the opposite side of the room from Cornelius Ashworth, while 400 people watched, was its own statement, and it was the wrong one. He extended his hand. "Cornelius, I didn't expect." "No," Cornelius said simply. He did not take the hand. "I imagine you didn't." The refusal was quiet. Not a scene, not a confrontation, a hand not taken, and in the social language of this room, in front of these people, it landed harder than any raised voice could have. Rafferty's hand came back down. "I think we should speak privately," he said. "I agree," said Cornelius, "but not tonight. My attorneys will contact yours on Monday morning." Prentice stepped forward and spoke with the measured, precise diction of a man who understands that every word he says in a professional context is a brick that builds or dismantles something. "A thorough review of Cole and Associates partnership structures and early financing history will be necessary," he said. "Given recent developments, including the capital arrangements of the company's founding years and the public narrative your company has maintained around them." Rafferty stared at him. "Those arrangements were properly documented." "We know," Prentice said. "We have all the documentation, so does Beatrix Lowe." The name landed. And in that moment, Rafferty Cole understood, completely, irreversibly, that his wife had not been quietly unraveling these past months. She had been building something. Methodically, patiently, with the precision of a woman raised by Cornelius and Cecily Ashworth, who had absorbed from childhood. The understanding that the person who moves first rarely wins, but the person who moves right always does. He turned and looked across the ballroom at Evangeline. She was sitting beside her mother. Neither of them was watching him with triumph or satisfaction. They were simply present, composed, unhurried, entirely themselves, and the contrast between their stillness and the way his own chest was tightening was more eloquent than anything anyone in this room could have said. Cecily Ashworth appeared beside Aurelia. She had not been heard approaching. Cecily moved quietly when she chose to. The two women looked at each other. "You're Aurelia Bright," Cecily said. It was not a question. "Yes," Aurelia said, her voice held, barely. "I've heard about you," Cecily said, and the specific, measured, entirely neutral tone of it made it the most withering thing spoken in that room all evening, because it didn't specify what she had heard. That Aurelia had been a known quantity to this family. That whatever she had imagined about being unseen or underestimated by Evangeline's people was a fantasy she had constructed entirely in her own mind. Aurelia's chin lifted slightly, the last remnant of the evening's confidence. Then you know I care about Rafferty. Cecily considered this. I know that you made a series of decisions, and I understand ambition. I have spent my life around ambitious people. She paused. But there is a difference between ambition and what you did in this room tonight. You stood in front of 400 people and tried to humiliate my daughter. You pointed at her. You held up a glass to her husband in her presence and called their marriage something to be celebrated as a departure. Her voice did not change pitch, did not waver. My daughter has never required this family's intervention. She is entirely capable of handling her own life. But we do not stand in rooms while one of our own is publicly diminished and do nothing. She looked at Aurelia with the unblinking calm that is always more devastating than anger. So, whatever victory you came here to celebrate tonight, I want you to look around this room right now and tell me honestly what you see. Aurelia looked. The board members who had been speaking with Prentice were now in urgent, quiet conversation with two people she recognized as Cole and Associates investors. Several of the most prominent guests in the room were gathered in conversation with Cornelius, and whatever he was communicating was landing with visible weight. Donna Fairchild had moved from Evangeline's table and was now speaking with 4 other women, all of them significant figures in Toronto's philanthropic sector, and whatever was being said was being received with the focused, leaning in attention of people who are being offered something worth their time. And Evangeline was still at her table, still composed, still entirely herself. Aurelia understood in that moment the full dimensions of what she had walked into. Not an ambush, that word was too crude, a consequence, a natural, inevitable consequence of choices she had made with incomplete information against a woman she had fundamentally misread. She had studied Evangeline Cole, wife of a successful developer, charitable presence, quiet woman who seemed not to notice her own husband's obvious interest in someone else. She had not studied Evangeline Ashworth. That was not a tactical oversight. It was a foundational one, and it had been made the first moment Aurelia Bright had looked at a composed woman and decided that composed meant undefended. Rafferty found Aurelia near the cloakroom 20 minutes later. The conversation between them was short and terrible. I have to speak with the board tonight, he said. What's happening to the company? She asked. Tell me honestly. He looked at her, and she saw in his face something she had not seen once in 18 months of what she had believed was a genuine and deepening relationship. Something that looked, in this light, like regret, not about her exactly, about himself. The 2012 financing round was structured throughout introductions that came through Cornelius Ashworth's network, he said slowly. Properly documented, arm's length, but I spent 10 years telling the story of this company in a way that left that part out. And now Prentice Ashworth is making sure my board understands what the story actually was. And Beatrix Lowe, she said. He nodded. She asked him the question she had been building toward all evening. Did you actually intend to leave her? He was quiet for a long moment, and what she saw in his face was not the clear, committed certainty of a man who had made a choice he stood behind. It was something more ambiguous and more painful, the expression of a man who had told himself a story for 18 months without fully examining whether he believed it. I told you I did, he said. That's not what I asked, she said. He didn't answer. She walked away. Back through the thinning ballroom, she collected her coat. She left. Head up, without looking back. The room barely marked her departure, and Evangeline thought, watching from her table, was perhaps the truest measure of the evening. Not the drama of the arrival, not the confrontations or the quiet phone calls, now being made by board members in the corridor. The truest measure was the departure of the woman who had announced her victory, and the room's complete indifference to watching her leave. Evangeline found her father near the windows, away from the main crowd. They stood together, quietly, for a moment the way the Ashworths always did, comfortable in silence, because families with enough shared history don't need to fill every moment with sound. "The board members are asking the right questions," Cornelius said. "Prentice will follow up on Monday." "He will." She looked at him. "Dad, when I called you in January and told you what I was thinking, did you know it would go this far tonight?" Cornelius considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I knew it was possible," he said. "I didn't know Rafferty would be foolish enough to make such a public announcement. That surprised me. I thought he had more self-preservation instinct." "He planned it with her," Evangeline said. "Her father absorbed this. Then he underestimated you more thoroughly than I thought." He looked at her steadily, which is his loss in every sense of that phrase. She was quiet for a moment. "I don't feel victorious," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I'm not standing here feeling triumphant. I feel tired and sad, and I feel like I spent 11 years making myself smaller than I needed to be for someone who wasn't paying close enough attention to deserve it." "The years weren't wasted," her father said, with the directness he always brought to the things that mattered most. "You were becoming who you are right now. That doesn't happen without the material you have to work with." He put his hand briefly on her shoulder. "And who you are right now, Evangeline, is remarkable." She looked at him for a long moment, and she was not going to cry. She had made that decision 2 hours earlier, when she had stepped out of the car on Front Street, and she held to it. But it required something that had not been required all evening. She looked across the room. Prentice caught her eye and gave her the small, brief nod that meant, "First pieces are in place." Her mother was now in conversation with Donna Fairchild and 2 other women, and she could see from the quality of it, the forward lean, the phones being exchanged, the seriousness of the engagement, that something real was being built in that exchange. Her mother had spent 30 years knowing exactly what she was doing in moments like these. Evangeline crossed the room and sat down beside Donna without waiting to be invited, because she was Evangeline Ashworth and she did not need an invitation. "I want to tell you 3 something," she said. "I'm establishing a foundation, the Ashworth Trades Initiative, funding and supporting women entering skilled trades and technical professions across Ontario. Women who have been told those fields aren't for them. I have 2 anchor commitments already. I'm looking for board members who understand this is not a feel-good project. This is a 20-year commitment." Donna didn't hesitate. "When do we start?" "Thursday," Evangeline said. "My father is clearing his schedule." She stood. She crossed back to her family. And Evangeline Ashworth, not Cole, not anymore, not in any way that mattered, walked out of the Fairmont Royal York with her father on her left, and her mother on her right, and her brother at her back, and the January night air hit her face, and she breathed it in, and she thought about Thursday. About everything that Thursday was the beginning of. The settlement negotiations took 7 weeks. They were conducted entirely through attorneys, with no direct contact between Evangeline and Rafferty, and they produced terms that reflected, for the first time in any formal document, the accurate history of how Cole and Associates had actually been built. Evangeline's settlement was substantial. It included a non-disparagement agreement that protected both parties, because she was done performing this story for an audience. She had a different story now, and it was just beginning. The board's independent review of Cole and Associates took 3 months. Rafferty retained his position, but the company's public founding narrative was formally and permanently revised. In the world he operated in, a public correction of the story you had been telling about yourself for a decade was its own form of consequence, quiet, thorough, and completely impossible to undo. Aurelia resigned from the company 3 days after the gala. Those who knew her, in the months that followed, said she was doing the difficult, unglamorous work of understanding the distance between who she had been and who she intended to become. Evangeline, who was not an unfeeling person, hoped that was true. 6 months after the settlement was signed, the Ashworth Trades Initiative held its first board meeting in a space on King Street that Evangeline had leased under her own name with her own capital. 12 people sat around the table. Donna Fairchild, 2 colleagues she had brought, a woman named Preeti from Peterborough who ran the most successful Women in Welding program in Ontario and had made the trip because Cecily had called her personally. Cornelius at the far end, positioned deliberately as an advisor, not a leader, at Evangeline's specific request, which he had honored without question, because he understood better than most the difference between supporting someone and overshadowing them. Evangeline stood at the head of the table. "I want to be honest about why this foundation exists," she said. "Not the polished vision, the real one. I spent 11 years in a marriage where I was consistently undervalued by the person who was supposed to know me best, and I want to say something honest about that. Part of that was my doing. Not the betrayal, that was his choice, but the degree to which I made myself quieter, smaller, less present than I actually was in order to fit inside someone else's version of what my life should look like. That was something I participated in. I won't do that again." She paused. "And the women this foundation exists for, a lot of them are doing that same thing right now. Being patient in ways that cost them everything, waiting to be seen by people who have already decided not to look." She looked around the table. "We are going to change that. Not with anger, not with noise, with resources, with access, and with the absolute refusal to accept that a woman's value is determined by how loudly she announces herself." The room was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then Preeti started clapping, and everyone followed, and Evangeline let it land for exactly 1 moment before she raised one hand and said, "Good, now let's look at the numbers." A year after the gala, the Ashworth Trades Initiative held its first annual event in the same ballroom at the Fairmont Royal York. Evangeline had booked it deliberately. Not for symmetry, not to perform a narrative arc for an audience, but because she understood at a bone-deep level that the places where difficult things happen do not belong to the pain. They are simply places. And the most powerful thing you can do with a place that held a hard memory is fill it with something better. The room held 500 people. The standing ovation when she walked onto the stage was something she had prepared for, logistically, and had not, until that moment, prepared for in her body. The complete physical reality of a you built with everything you had, now standing in front of you and asking you to claim it. She claimed it. "A year ago," she said, standing at the microphone in the same room where Aurelia had raised her glass, "I sat here as a woman who had been underestimated for so long that I had started, in certain quiet ways, to underestimate myself. Someone stood in this room and tried to use my patience against me. Tried to use my silence as evidence of my defeat." The room was completely still. What she didn't know, what I had spent months making certain no one knew until the right moment, was that my silence was not defeat. My composure was not weakness. The stillness of a woman who is thinking is not the stillness of a woman who has given up. She paused. The quietest person in the room is often the one who has already decided exactly what happens next. 500 people responded to that. She let them. She stood in the room where it had all turned and thought about every woman not in this room tonight, in workshops and offices and training programs and marriages, and every place where the work of being underestimated is quietly, exhaustingly endured, and she thought, that is why we scale. That is why the work is only starting. After the program, after the donor announcements, and the conversations, and the Toronto Life journalist, who asked sharp questions and received sharp answers, she found a quiet moment near the windows with her father. They stood together, without speaking, the way the Ashworths always did. Then Cornelius said, "Your grandmother would have loved tonight." Evangeline touched her pearl earrings. "She used to say," he continued, "that the most underestimated woman in any room is the one doing the most careful thinking." He looked at his daughter. She was talking about herself. But she was also talking about you. She saw it before you did. Evangeline looked at him. "I think I always knew," she said quietly. "I just needed the circumstances to prove it." Cecily appeared beside them, slipping her hand through Cornelius's arm with the ease of 40 years. She looked at Evangeline with the expression she had worn the morning after the gala, a year ago. The expression that said, "I always knew this was coming. I was simply waiting for you to arrive at it ready." "Ready to go?" Cecily asked. "Almost," Evangeline said. She turned and looked at the ballroom one last time, the room where Aurelia had raised her glass, where Rafferty had stood at a microphone and announced his own miscalculation, where the Ashworths had walked through the doors and changed everything simply by being exactly who they had always been. She looked at it and felt none of the residual weight she had expected, no ghost of the humiliation, just the room, emptying now, the servers moving through it quietly, the chandeliers beginning to dim. A space ready to be reset for whatever came next. That was the thing about rooms, she thought, about all the places where difficult things happen. They don't remember you. You have to do your own remembering, and you get to decide what the memory means. She had decided this room was where Evangeline Ashworth had stopped waiting and started building. That was the memory she was keeping. She turned and walked out with her parents through the lobby, and through the glass doors, and into the February night. And the cold air of Toronto hit her face and she breathed it in, and the city moved around her the way it always does. Indifferent, constant, full of everything that might still happen. She was ready for it. She had come into this year as someone's wife. She was leaving it as herself. And that was not a consolation. That was not the story you tell yourself when you need to find meaning in loss. That was the truest, most irreversible thing that had happened to her. The recovery of herself, complete and clear, and entirely her own, answering to no one's definition but the one she had, without fully knowing it, been building toward her entire life. Some people find out who they are in the easy years. Evangeline Ashworth found out in the hardest one. And what she found was this: she was the woman who knew how to wait for the right moment, who understood that silence is not surrender, who had always known, even in the years she had briefly forgotten it, that the quietest person in the room is often the one who has already decided what happens next. She had been that woman all along. Now the whole room knew it.